Hello and welcome to News Farm. I'm your host Chris with the CHRILLCAST, and today we're going to be talking about something really important in the gaming industry and something that a lot of people don't really discuss. So make sure you guys like this video, comment down below, and as always, subscribe. So we're going to be talking about attach rates for consoles, which is essentially broken down to the amount of games per console sale. Okay, so we're started off with Nintendo, who released technically the Game & Watch first, but that would technically be a 1-to-1 game to console ratio, since every Game Gear had essentially one game or maybe a couple games on it, but you could not purchase software for those games, although the Game & Watch was a commercial success. So it's not a good example, but it is technically Nintendo's first foray into gaming. We'll start with the NES/Famicom, which existed between 1983 to 2003, or if you're in the States, 1985 to 1995, with just under 62 million sales and about 500 million software sales for the NES/Famicom, which comes to a number of about 8.076 games per console sold, which essentially means that for every NES or Famicom that was sold, the owner would buy approximately 8 games. That would be a commercial success. And then we have the SNES, or the Super Famicom, from 1990 to 2003, selling just under 50 million units and around 379 million software sales cartridges, with a game attach rate of 7.72 games per console. That means per SNES sold, you could expect to have over 7, almost 8 games sold per console sold. With the N64, that number goes down. We have 32.93 million consoles sold, with around 224.97 software sales for the console, which brings you to about 7 games to be sold per console. Means for every N64 sold, around 7 games were sold per console. This is debatable, but generally speaking, the N64 is still considered to be a success, despite losing Nintendo's prominence in the gaming market to PlayStation. Then you move on to the GameCube, 2001 to 2007, 21, almost 22 million sales, with around 208 million software sales. Now, this is kind of an interesting one because you have an attach rate of just under 10. That means every GameCube owner bought about 10 games, but it wasn't a commercial success, which is interesting because in general, when you have more games per console sold, that's good. But sometimes it can also indicate a failure because, generally speaking, when you have less sales, only the more dedicated buyers are buying the console. Now, financially, the GameCube was likely successful overall, but it was not a commercial success compared to its rivals. Now, like I said, when you have the more dedicated audience buying the console, they're more likely to buy more games. So less consoles, more games per console, but less overall sales in general. All right, moving on to the Wii. 101.63 million hardware sales, 921.85 software sales, which rounds to about 9 games per Wii. That's insanity. I mean, that's 9 games per console, 100 million. That is a commercial success. That is a business study case success of a console launch, which is interesting because we'll get into it later here. When you look at the Wii U, 2012-2017, 13.56 million sales and about 103.45 million software sales, which brings us to about 7.629 games per console sold. Now, here's a point where we see the software and the hardware dip in the same generation, and the Wii U is generally considered a failure. It's not a commercial success. It's Nintendo's worst selling gaming anything since the Virtual Boy. But the attach rate was still pretty good, and like I said, that's dedicated fans buying the console hardware and then 7.5 games per console. All right, moving on to the Switch. We have 103.54 million hardware sales, with 766.41 software sales currently. I mean, that's going to go up most likely, but still. With a number like that, you would expect that the games per console will go up, but in fact, it does not. You're looking at less than the Wii U in games per console, but you're looking at way more console, way more software sold. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that a more casual fan base has adopted the console, which means you have a lot more sales overall. However, you have less sales per console, so you need to make each sale count. You need to give them Mario Kart, Zelda, Metroid, all of the franchises to hit every different niche in your fan base. Now, it is definitely a commercial success. No one's arguing against that. But it's less of a commercial success than the Wii, which had an attach rate of 9 games per console, whereas the Switch is at 7.4 games per console. I do think it will surpass the Wii in software sales, as it's already surpassed it in hardware sales, and it's still young in its lifespan. But that is kind of a stark contrast when you look at the Switch versus the Wii. And I think we can explain that one a little bit more here when we go down to handhelds. Now, we already talked about the Game & Watch. Move on to the Game Boy. 1989 to 2003, 118.69 million sales to 501.11 million software sales for the Game Boy, which has a games per console attach rate of 4.2. 222 repeating, whatever you want to call it. Now, this was a commercial success, but you're looking at 4 games per Game Boy. And I think that has to do with the fact that you're talking portables. Now, overall, portables tend to sell less games per console than your console counterparts. So if you look at the trend in games per console on the handheld side, the Switch is actually doing better than every previous handheld, but slightly worse than most of the successful consoles. I think these trends work together. I think Nintendo likely noticed the trend in handhelds selling tons and tons of hardware, and your console selling tons and tons of software, and they said, let's marry those two things together to make the first hybrid of our Nintendo lineup. And then you wind up with the Switch, which is selling really well in hardware and software. Compared with the handhelds and software, it's doing very well. Compared with the consoles in hardware, it's doing well. It's the best-selling console hardware, and it's the second best in software sales in handhelds. So that tells you something right there. Now, if you look at the Game Boy Advance, had 81.51 million hardware sales to 377.42 software sales, which gives you an attach rate of 4.63. And then when you get to the DS, you have 154 million against 948 million software sales, which gives you an attach rate of 6.159. And now keep in mind, all of Nintendo's handhelds were commercial successes. And then when you get down to the 3DS, you have a slight dip in both software and hardware sales at 75.94 million to 387.99 million, and a rate of 5.1. Still above the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, but below the DS. And then the Switch is just killing it. It's got 103 million hardware sales to 766.41 software sales at a 7.4 commercial success. We go down to PlayStation here. Every PlayStation console is selling crazy good numbers. And the PS4 is slightly off because for some reason Sony's software sales are considered PS5 and PS4 as of the PS5's launch. So it's hard to estimate the exact number, but it's somewhere above 10 games per console on the PS4. So let's go on through this. PS1, 102.49 hardware sales to 882.97 million software sales. Gives you an attach rate of 8.61. Now, if you look back, the PlayStation was going up against the N64, and it beat it in attach rate, sales, and software sales. PlayStation 2, 155 million hardware sales to 1.44463 billion software sales. That's an attach rate of 9.32019, whatever you want to get to that commercial success rate of the PS2. That is crazy. So it's a really high attach rate. That means pretty much every PlayStation console has been guaranteed to sell minimum 9 games for every console sold. Get to the PS3, you've got 87.4 million hardware sales to 829.6 software sales. So you're looking at an attach rate of 9.5 games per console. And then with the PS4, just insane success. 116.9 million sales to about 1.5 billion software sales, which gives you an attach rate above 10. And the PS5, we just don't know yet, but the latest numbers show 18.21 million software or hardware sales. Now, Sony, on the other hand, unlike Nintendo, has been not very successful in the portables market, which is why they dropped out of it. But the PSP had 82 million hardware sales to about 260 million software sales, which gives you just above 3 games per PSP. And part of that, I think, was fueled by the homebrew jailbreak scene, which is why Sony does not like that scene. And they made the proprietary memory of the Vita, which sold around 15 million hardware sales and around 60 million software sales. So technically speaking, this did better in attach rate for games, but worse in overall sales. So that's why Sony left the portable market. Just didn't do well. And their attach rate is not as good as Nintendo's in the hardware or the software hardware space for handhelds. Now, Sega, this is an interesting one. So Sega SG-1000, we don't have enough data to really determine an attach rate for the SG-1000. It was also a Japan-only console and was not considered a commercial success. Now, Sega was poised to be essentially the Sony against Nintendo in the 80s, 90s, and they just failed to deliver what they were supposed to. So you've got with the Master System, 22 million sales against the NES's 60 million sales at 422.47 million software sales. I believe that's accurate, which would give you almost 20 games per Master System sold. I'd have to double check that. That number seems a little off, but that's still crazy attach rate. The Mega Drive, or the Genesis, as we call it in the States, was from 1988 to 1997, directly competing with the NES and then the Super Nintendo. It's sold about 50 million units. It actually was pretty well even with the Super Nintendo in sales, with 576.16 million software sales, so an attach rate above 10, about 11.5. And if we look at the Super Nintendo, it had an attach rate of 7.7. So Sega Genesis was selling almost 5 more games per console than the Super Nintendo was, which is why they kept saying Genesis does what Nintendo don't. But then they really messed things up with the Saturn. That was a lot of stuff in the background, but essentially you got 17 million units sold of the Saturn, which was against the PlayStation, which had 100 million units and an 8.6 attach rate, and the N64, which had 32 million hardware sales and a 6.8 attach rate. Now this is going to have a similar effect to what I had earlier. You got 17 million Saturn sold to 150 million software sales, which gives an 8.8. So even though you have a failing hardware, you have a high attach rate because it's mostly your big fans of Sega that are buying the Saturn. They follow that up with the Dreamcast. It only was out about 3 years, but it did 11 million sales, most of that in the front end. 85 million software sales, which gives you an attach rate of 7.72. So all the people that were burned by the Saturn that still bought a Dreamcast, so you got your super fans of Sega, and that's why your attach rate remains still pretty high. Now here's where you can really see how hardware sales don't necessarily reflect a success versus the software sales. Now if you look at Xbox, the original Xbox, 24 million sales in hardware, 261.63 software sales. This was Xbox's entrance into the console market and had an attach rate above 10. That's pretty good. That's a successful console. Xbox 360, same idea here. 84 million hardware sales to 905 million software sales. That is insane. That is more than 10 games by a long shot, just like the original Xbox, and it was the best-selling console for a while until the PS3 surpassed it, but it has a higher attach rate than the Wii. Remember, the Wii was at 9. The Xbox 360 was at 10, almost 11. 905 million sales versus 921. And they had about like 16, 17 million less consoles sold. That's pretty amazing. Then with Don Matrick and the DRM loving Xbox One, you have 51 million hardware sales, which is the second highest selling Xbox console of all time, against less sales than the original Xbox at 244.52 million software sales, which gives you an attach rate of less than 5. This was Xbox's worst selling console of all time. Now, they only had 3 total at that time, so it's not like Xbox has had a lot of chances to fail, but the Xbox One was by all means not a commercial success. And then with the Xbox Series X and S, we're looking at about 13 million sales-ish. So we still don't know whether it's going to be a success, but it's sounding like yes. So we shall see. And once we have some better numbers, I'll make sure we update this video in the future. But as you can see, the higher games per console, when you sell a lot of consoles, the better. If you have a lot of games per console but low sales, it does not mean, or it means that you have mostly fans that bought the console, essentially. If you have a high software number, low sales, that's a weird place to be. But for the most part, high games per console is a good thing unless you have low hardware sales. That means that usually you had a very niche, basically like your Nintendo fans or your Sony fans or your Xbox fans. And that can keep you financially viable, but it's not a commercial success. When you hit these higher numbers like the Wii or the Switch, where you hit 100 million and high games per console attach rates, that's a good thing too. There's this weird trend of handhelds where successful handhelds tend to sell less games per console than your console counterparts. And that means that the Switch is the most successful handheld of Nintendo just by pure attach rate. But as far as consoles go, it's less successful in attach rate than the Wii, which is the only comparable console in sales, 101 to 103 million. So, I don't know, just an interesting set of data. And I hope I've kept your attention, but I'm going to call this one good. Please let me know what you guys think about attach rates, consoles, etc. Was this an informational video for you? Or was it boring and dry and I shouldn't do it again? Let me know what you guys think. Comment down below, subscribe, like the video, and I'll see you all on the next one. Bye, guys.